everyone! Okay, so before I get into the video, I want to introduce you to my new cat, Hazelnut. She was pulled out of a hole in my apartment building's courtyard, you know, just the way that people get cats typically. She is in heat. Her spay appointment is later this week. Just my luck that she goes into heat a week before her spay. So she's a little noisy right now. She's being quiet this second, but if she starts screaming, you will know why. So story time. When I was in one of my upper division history classes in college, I was tasked with an assignment where I had to write a biographical paper on one Asian historical figure. I chose Kim Jong-il because we had just studied Maoist China, and I was really shocked by the details of the famine in the late 50s, early 60s. I might make a video on that. And I wanted to know a little bit more about the North Korean famine in the 1990s and if it was under similar circumstances. So I chose Kim Jong-il. That was its own strange thing. We don't actually know where he was born, but that's a whole different story for a different day. Really, the point is, as part of research for that, I read this book, Escape from Camp 14, and when I was trying to understand a little bit more of the critical reaction to it and if it's been accepted as like a valid retelling of, you know, some aspects of life of North Korea, I found that a couple of years after it was published, the author had retracted a good portion of his statements. This is something that I found quite shocking because I didn't really understand why someone would have lied or told, you know, mistruths in the first place. Like, if your goal is to shine light on the atrocities in North Korea and share your experience there, wouldn't lying feed ammo to people who are maybe have ulterior motives or for some reason want to downplay the human rights violations of North Korea? So this conundrum kind of tugged at my mind for a couple of years, and I decided once I was starting this channel back up, I thought it would be a good idea to kind of explore why this would happen in the first place, and it's a very, very nuanced topic. There are North Korean defectors that have told their stories in a way that lines up with other information we know about North Korea and is generally accepted to be true or very highly plausible. There are also defectors, oftentimes ones who are very famous, who the more famous they get and the more attention they get, it seems more discrepancies start to pop up in their stories. Some of them tell just out and out obvious lies, but we'll get to that. So there are a lot of different motives for this. There's also varying levels of truths and untruths. You also have to take a look at why these people are sharing these stories, who's commissioning that, and what the reactions are to it, because it's a big mixed bag. There are a lot of people who will take all defector testimonies, take the most shocking ones, and use them as an example of the evils of North Korea, and there are some people who, because of this, will say that all North Korean defector testimony is fake and it's Western propaganda, the DPRK does nothing wrong, they just want to make you think that it's evil because, I don't know, Red Scare or something like that. So this is something that we have to tread very lightly with. Let's go back into the historical background, because I don't think the average person really knows how North Korea came to be or why we're in this conundrum in the first place and why North Koreans are even trying to leave in the first place. Okay, maybe that answer seems obvious, but there still is more background to it than most people would know. So in the early 1900s, particularly the 1910s, Korea was annexed by Japan. Japan was becoming imperial, it was trying to take over a lot of countries. They were pretty brutal rulers, but that's for a different video that I probably will make at some point. What you need to know is that they displaced the original Korean government, the Choson dynasty, and they ruled Korea until the 1940s when they lost World War II. Because they were defeated by the US and Russia, yes, the Soviet Union was involved in that. The US wasn't the only one who launched any kind of invasion or attack on Japan in August of 1945. Shit. Here, play with the banana. Yes, the Soviet Union was involved in the defeat of Japan in World War II. The US wasn't the only one to launch an attack or invade Japan in August of 1945. That being said, once Japan was defeated and its colonies were liberated, some were able to go back to their original ruling class, but that didn't really exist in Korea anymore. It had been decades. There was a power vacuum now. And so the USSR and the US did what they essentially did in Germany, where the country was sliced and diced and handed over to different powers. The same thing was effectively done. The country was split at the 38th parallel, and the USSR was responsible for the North, and the US was responsible for the South, and they both installed their own governments there. The USSR installed an authoritarian dictatorship, and the US tried to have some kind of election, but it went really poorly, and effectively the country was a military dictatorship all the way up until the 1980s when it became more democratic. Now, these days, it's considered a full democracy, but even that's like kind of shaky. Once again, different video. Come on, stop screaming. So in 1950, the North launched an invasion into the South, and this kicked off the Korean War, and it was a pretty brutal war. The North pushed the South down to Busan, then the UN got involved, sent a bunch of troops from various countries, including the US. They pushed the North Koreans back all the way up to the Yalu River at the northern border with China. Then MacArthur ordered them to start firing across the border into China, and that went really poorly. The Chinese sent reinforcements, and that pushed the South Koreans back down to the 38th parallel, so the war became a stalemate at essentially the point where it began. The stalemate lasted for a couple of years, and then in 1953 an armistice, aka a ceasefire, was signed, and that effectively paused the war. The war is still technically going on, and the peninsula is still divided at the 38th parallel. And it wasn't long after that when the first defector in that same year wound up fleeing from the north to the south, but there wasn't much movement between the two countries. Famously, a few Americans defected north. There were some people from the north defecting south, but for the most part the countries remained pretty divided. The war also completely devastated the peninsula. South Korea wound up having its own economic miracle in the 70s and 80s, while North Korea remained very impoverished. The fact that it doesn't have a whole lot of farmland and that the economy just never really recovered from the Korean War meant that it was super reliant on aid from its allies, China and the USSR, in order to get by. And even that's a bit of an oversimplification. If you want to really understand North Korea in the post-war years, this book, The Real North Korea, by Andrei Lankov, is excellent. You can tell that I have an old library copy from the complete opposite side of the country. That being said, in the 1960s, this is when the political prison system is really set up, and consistently about 150,000 people estimated have been in that system up to 2011. I wasn't able to find more up-to-date figures, but we know this not just from defector testimony, but also from satellite imagery. Keep this in mind. A lot of what we know about North Korea doesn't just come from defector testimony. So even though North Korea was pretty impoverished, reliant on aid, it did have a stable government and economy somewhat up until the 1990s, when two things happened. One, the USSR collapsed, meaning that one of the biggest sources of aid essentially dried up overnight, and the other factor was biblical floods that happened in the early part of the decade. This wiped out a bunch of the crop system, and this started a total economic collapse of the country. For most North Koreans, rather than going to a store or market to purchase food, they got distributions directly from the government, but this dried up in the 90s, and there wasn't food to go around to be sold, and so a massive famine took place. Figures really kind of range on how many people died. The figures that I've seen have been a range between 200 and 600,000 people who lost their lives to starvation. At this time, too, the black market system pops up. Once again, if you want more info, check out this book. But this also really fanned the flames of people escaping to the south. Between this and the authoritarianism of it all, North Korea just didn't seem really viable to stay in for many people, and they were willing to take a really risky journey and leave behind their friends and family in order to find a different life in South Korea or sometimes in Western countries. So Shin Dong-hyuk is the subject of Escape from Camp 14, though he didn't technically write the book. Blaine Harden, a journalist, did. He interviewed Shin and wrote the book based on those testimonies. Shin has also published his own novel in Korean, and we actually see some differences between the Korean memoir and the English biography written by Harden. This book garnered a lot of attention. It told a lot of really scary stories and really frightening ones. Shin claims to have been born in Camp 14, or, let me see what it's called in Korean. Kecheon te Shibsa Kwaliso. I think I got that mostly correct. My Korean is a little bit rusty. In the English biography, he claims to have been born there, essentially lived his whole life there up until he escaped. He also details the executions of his mother and brother for their hatching their own escape plan. He claims that they were planning to escape, and he went and reported it to a security guard, leading to their executions. He also describes getting a finger chopped off for dropping a sewing machine when he was doing a kind of factory job. And also he claims to have been strung up and tortured over a fire. Girl! As you can tell by the details that I just told you, this book garnered a huge shocked reaction from Western audiences and gave a lot of attention to Shin. He appeared in a 60 Minutes special, he spoke to panels, he was featured in a German documentary, and he was the subject of countless articles in the media. However, not everyone really bought his story. Other defectors questioned certain aspects of his testimony, some even claiming that they knew him and knew that he hadn't lived in Camp 14 his whole life. And then North Korea released its own video refuting a lot of the claims. The video shows Shin's father, who Shin had previously claimed was dead, and his new wife doing what was essentially a character assassination of Shin. They claim that Shin's mother and brother were executed not for trying to escape, but for doing murder. And that Shin had assaulted a woman, and that's part of why he ran away. Enough people were refuting Shin's story that the pressure seemed to have gotten to him, and he wound up retracting a good portion of his story in a message to Hardin. Hardin published the details about this on his blog, but basically some of the major claims that got refuted were the fact that Shin was born and lived his whole life in Camp 14, the circumstances around his brother and mother's execution. He claims that they were accused of, but that they were not actually found guilty, but still executed anyway. From there, Hardin had to decide what he wanted to do with the book. Initially, he thought about pulling it from shelves and just rewriting it altogether. What he wound up doing, though, was just writing a new foreword with the corrections and keeping the book as is. I have my copy somewhere around here, but I can't seem to find it today, so I can't see if this is one that includes that correction forward or not. If I do happen across it, I'll post a little update into this video. It really bugged me when I found out about this, of thinking about why this might have happened. Hardin says that according to Shin, these are really, really hard events for him to relive when he tells it, so he changed the details of the stories to make it a little less painful. I think that's a possible explanation. Also, the fact that it did garner so much attention and possibly, gave him some money to support himself with is also another motivation. But we don't know that many details about the finances of Shin, unlike a certain other celebrity defector who is told much, much more questionable stories, Yeonmi Park. Yeonmi Park's notoriety began in 2011 when she appeared on a Korean variety show called On My Way to Meet You. There she was called the Paris Hilton of North Korea because she came from a wealthy family, though their family certainly faced issues. According to Park, both her mother and father spent several years in prison. Nonetheless, eventually they escaped. Park settled in South Korea. Park published her first memoir, got plenty of attention from that, and then in 2014 she moved over to the US. She attended Columbia University after that, graduated in 2020, and then immediately started a media tour denouncing the Ivy League. She started saying that American universities are full of wokeism and cancel culture, and really playing into all the things that the right wing wants to hear about American universities. And her perspective as a North Korean refugee living in the US seemed to have given credibility to how authoritarian, us saying pronouns are. It's pretty easy to see that she essentially became a grifter. She was on payroll for Turning Point USA. We know that she was getting paid $6,600 a month at one point for her appearances in their videos. She was interviewed by Jordan B. Peterson, went on the Joe Rogan Experience, and became just overall a talking head for the right wing when trying to compare, the horrors of not being a jerk to people to the Kim regime. An apt comparison. Since the beginning as well, many scholars and defectors had questioned her details and her life story, though the claims get more outlandish as time goes on. But initially, there were just some questions around discrepancies between her telling and her mother's telling of their stories. Her mother claims to have never gone to prison at all, for example. Some of these discrepancies Park has tried to chalk up to not being proficient in English, especially in the 2010s. For example, she claims that she crossed some mountains to escape, but the town that she escaped from only had hills between itself and the North Korean border. That one could potentially reasonably be chalked up to not having a full grasp of the English language, though the prison discrepancy, that I don't think can be explained by differences in language. But she also claimed early on that you could be executed for watching foreign movies in North Korea, something that Andrei Lenkov, our expert I cited earlier, questioned immediately, since he had talked to other defectors who said that wasn't necessarily the case. Similarly, she claimed that North Koreans had no conception of romantic love, which that one's also really easy to debunk because love songs are one of the most popular categories of songs in North Korea, and also North Koreans are also just people and have the same urges and desires as people all over the world, despite, living under an authoritarian regime. Like, that doesn't change their humanity. Some of the claims have gotten more and more outlandish. One in the last couple of years that really garnered a lot of attention was the claim that Park made on Joe Rogan's podcast that North Korea only had one train, and that train did not move under the power of its own engine. Instead, it was pushed by people. Immediately, a bunch of people questioned this because it's just so far-fetched. A journalist asked her, for evidence of this. She said that she hadn't seen it herself, that she had seen pictures of this happening. And she sent those pictures to journalists, which actually didn't show people pushing trains. They were just pictures of trains. So this is obviously pretty outlandish, and it's pretty clear to see that Yeonmi Park has just become an out-and-out grifter for the American right wing because, well, it's extremely profitable. We see this with failed, Hollywood actors all the time. Even before she sold out to the American right wing, she was already making a lot of money. Her media appearances often garnered her between $12,500 and $17,500. And I did see a number for her book that she made $1.1 million from her initial book deal, though it's hard to find an actual source for that claim. I read this on Wikipedia. I tried going to the little hyperlink citation, and the article that it linked to did not say any specific numbers like that. So I don't actually know where that came from. So take that one with a grain of salt. Nonetheless, she has made a good amount of money from basically being a celebrity defector. But even for regular defectors, there still is an economic incentive. According to Sung Ji-young, who wrote this article, Why Defector Testimonies Fall Apart So Often, she mentions that it's the norm for interviewees to receive cash payments for sharing their stories, and that oftentimes the more shocking the testimony, the more money they're able to ask for. And North Koreans aren't dumb. They know what the Western media wants to hear, so they're going to play up their stories in order to feed into that so that they can continue to get paid for doing interviews. So there's one economic incentive, even for more regular people, to muddy up their stories. In speaking with someone named Choi Sung-chul from the Korean National Residents Association, he said that the line between the smaller and larger inconsistencies in stories is hard to tell, and that, quote, most North Koreans do not worry about small factual mistakes as long as the big picture that North Korea violates human rights is right. This seems to be a big cultural difference from the West, where if someone has one inaccuracy in their story, oftentimes people call into question the whole thing. And I'm not going to say which side is right or wrong on that, just to point out how this complicates matters. And it's easy to deride these people for putting an economic value on their stories and for essentially selling played-up testimonies to Western media for the sake of profit. While I don't condone lying, if you look at what life is like for many North Korean defectors after they arrive in South Korea, it becomes a little bit clearer how this happens. North Korean defectors, after they've made the journey south, which is usually very harrowing, usually they escape from North Korea via brokers who take them through China, where in China they risk getting deported back to North Korea and then thrown in political prison. They also risk being trafficked, essentially, sold as either workers or wives. From there, they typically either fly into South Korea or they'll go down to Southeast Asia, where they are caught and then deported to South Korea. Once they arrive there, they spend 3 months in something called Hanawon, which is essentially home ec on steroids. Here, they're given life skills like using credit cards, using ATMs, finding a job. They're set up with cell phones and bank accounts, and kind of taught a little bit on how to adjust to society. After that, they're given a public housing rental unit. They're given subsidies for the next couple of years, food for a few days. They're introduced to the local community, and then they're essentially on their own after that. There are some supports, like a program where older police officers will come by and check on them every so often, kind of like a friendly uncle seems to be the idea. But if you're not able to get a job, you're gonna have a hard time. Despite the North Korean refugees and employers having economic incentives to, employ North Koreans or for North Koreans to stay in jobs, It's actually really hard to find one because most of them don't come with solid education or work experience that might get them a job in the South. There are free education opportunities for North Koreans in the South, but they're often restricted by age. So for a lot of them, a good way to supplement their income if they're not able to go to school or find a decent paying job is to sell their stories. The other option is quite a bit darker. The worst example of someone who fell through the social safety net and wasn't able to get her feet underneath her was Han Sung-ul. She was a North Korean woman who eventually slowly starved with her 6-year-old son in their Seoul apartment, and they were eventually found deceased by neighbors. She has a really complicated story that shows just how difficult the life for a North Korean can be after they come to the South. She arrived in Seoul alone with no other family. At Hanwon, she was very withdrawn from the other people around her, and she didn't really share a lot, but people noted that she seemed very bright and that she was very pretty, and they thought that she would be able to get her feet underneath herself. However, life after Hanwon was pretty rocky. Afterwards, her Chinese husband, who many suspect that she was sold to, and her son moved to South Korea, and they moved to a city a little bit outside of Seoul. Things were kind of stable for a few years. They even had a second son, but eventually Han's husband and her eldest son went back to China, and they left her alone in South Korea without a divorce certificate, which is necessary in order to receive the social services needed for people supporting a child as a single parent. It also seems that she never went and asked for help, whether for more financial support or for mental support as well. An unfortunate 15% of refugees are the word on screen, many not even knowing that asking for help is an option. Eventually, Han ran out of money, and it's really sad to say, but she just ran out of money and ran out of food and didn't know what to do, and she and her son just slowly starved in their apartment. And it's just really horrifying, and I think when you see what the alternative is for some North Koreans who don't wind up putting a monetary value on their story, you understand why they might do it, because the absolute horrors and ironies of escaping a country that's super impoverished, has had a famine within recent decades, has such a lower standard of living compared to South Korea. To escape from there, go to South Korea, which is a wealthy country where the average standard of living is much higher, and then starve there is just heartbreaking. I think this really shows what I think is a solution to the conundrum of defectors telling untruths in their stories. I don't think you'll ever get it to the point where people don't lie at all, because that's just humanity. It seems just inherent that there are going to be some people who are liars. But if people are supported, if they don't have to worry about slowly starving, if they're able to have a more comfortable life in South Korea without having to rely on selling their stories, then they're gonna be less likely to do so. There is an article that I read in researching for this video called 80% of North Korean defectors are women, here's why, which is a true statistic, though the title is not very fitting for the article because it says much more than that. It has this closing paragraph that I really loved and that I'm going to read here to close out this video. By telling the stories of their lives, from the joys of their childhood to their education and careers, their family stories and how they loved the countryside where they lived, these North Korean defectors are trying to show us their humanity. Their country might be a joke in parts of our culture, but the refugees don't understand why their struggle, the ongoing struggle of their people, which Ji-yeon, one of the interviewees, considers the word on screen, isn't getting our attention. English people only see newspaper and TV coverage of a military nation, they watch the discipline, Ji-yeon says. But North Koreans are the same as us. They are also humans. They are people who matter to us. So sorry to end this on a dark note, but this is what I have for you today. When I tried to investigate the topic of why one man lied about his life story, it kind of opened up a whole can of worms, and I think we've explored a good chunk of that today. Stick around for more history if you want to. Like, subscribe, share the video as I'm trying to grow my channel. And if you have any topics that you really want me to cover, comment them down below. Otherwise, I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.